Now, in chapter 10 of Theologico-political Treatise by Baruch Spinoza, he looks at books that were, the way he describes it, are books that were written after Ezra. So I've said in the previous video, he does tell us that the first 12 books of the Bible were written by Ezra. Now, in chapter 10, he talks about books that were written after Ezra. And these books are from Chronicles, First Chronicles, Second Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Songs of Songs, Lamentations, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel. In fact, those are the books. He does talk about others like Hosea and Joel and Obadiah, these others, but Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Daniel, and Psalms, Job, these others, he does focus a lot on them. And he tells us it's hard to tell who wrote them, even though, of course, there is a general understanding that if we are talking about the book of Samuel, then it's Samuel who wrote the book. If we are talking about, not Samuel, sorry. If we are talking about the book of Nehemiah, Esther, Job, it's like there's a general understanding that the name that appears, the name that the book has is the name of the person who wrote the book. But Baruch tells us, no, that's not what it is. In fact, he goes into detail explaining why he thinks most of these books were written by other people and not the people whose name appear as the title of the titles of the books. So most of these books were written after, the books he focuses on in chapter 10 are books that were written after Ezra, and they were written after the restoration of the temple by Judas Maccabeus. And I've said it started with the books of Chronicles and then going to these other books. Now, in this chapter, he talks about, he brings up the issue of how some of these books were made part of the canon, like they were made part of the Old Testament. Because most of us think it was so simple, it was so easy. This book is written by a man inspired by the Spirit of God, let's have it in the Bible. But now, the way I explained it now, it takes you to face the reality of what was happening. The reality was there was so many books in circulation, and not all of them were included in the Bible. And in fact, it tells us even people who we have in the Bible, the likes of, let me give you a few examples. For example, there's somebody mentions Jonah and Hosea. He says there's somewhere in the Bible where it's mentioned that Hosea prophesied for over 80 years. But we have a very small text about his prophecy. So not everything was included. We have Jonah. Jonah used to prophesy for Israel and also for other nations. But the book we have about Jonah's story just talks about Nineveh, I think, a very small part of his work. So it tells us, number one, not all prophets were, not all prophets had their work included in the canon. And even those who were included, not all their work was included. So it's not as easy to think that it was so easy to bring in books. And in fact, it was a very political process. The way he explains it, it was a very political process. And sometimes, in fact, he says there are books that were not included that he thinks should have been included. He gives an example of the Book of Wisdom, and others that he mentions. And then there are others that were included, like Proverbs of Solomon, that is like, okay, it's a very insightful book, but maybe other books would have been given the priority to be part of the canon and all that one. So he says it doesn't really make sense what informed the decision to decide which books became part of the canon and which one were not supposed to be included. Anyways, the point is there were so many books in circulation during this time, and to some extent it was arbitral decisions on which book became part of the canon and which ones were ignored. So he does talk about that. He also to some extent questions the intentions and the intentions of the people who included these books. In fact, while we are told the 12 books are written by Ezra, when he was done, then there was this council, kind of like a synod. They call it a synod, like a council of religious leaders who met, and then they were choosing these books. And Baruch kind of like questions their intentions, and it's like they were being driven by some interests to choose particular books and to abandon others. Yeah, so he does talk about all those. He also does tell us that when it comes to the books of prophecy, the books were also, even individual books were fragments brought together. I found that to be very interesting, and he does go into detail of looking at these different books and explaining why he thinks a book like the book of Isaiah and Jeremiah are collections of narratives from different sources that were brought and made into single books. And he also tells us that the book of Jeremiah, part of it was written by a person who had the same name like his, Baruch. Interesting, I found that to be. And then he tells us that some books, prophetic books, in fact, the entire book is a fragment. And he gives us an example of the book of Ezekiel. And he does explain why he thinks that book is a fragment. A fragment in that it was a bigger book, and a section of it was hived and included in the Bible, while the other sections were left out. So that's what he says. The book of Ezekiel is a fragment. The entire book is a fragment. He also says, even within these books, for the book of Jeremiah and Isaiah, that are fragments of different texts, he says how these texts were brought together, it seems like they were done haphazardly. Like dates were not given attention so that there is harmonization, so that the narratives make sense throughout. He says like they were just thrown in together and then they were left like that, and then they've remained like that up until now. I've said that he says not all prophetic works were put in the Bible, not even works of those people we have in the Bible, whose work we have in the Bible, not the entire of their works were included. He also adds into the mystery of the identity of Job. Remember, I read Maimonides, The Guide for the Perplexed, and he has like an entire chapter talking about Job. And Job turns out to be a very mysterious character. In fact, even the way Maimonides explains him, even though the teachings from his book are very powerful teachings, at least according to Maimonides. Now, Baruch tells us of what other people say who Job was. And he says, likely Job was not that person who is described in the book as somebody who suffered and whatever. It's like, he says, like somebody who in fact lived a very comfortable life, but he was imagining things and trying to explain the providence, God's providence, and he comes up with this story. That's one. Two, he says that he tells us that there are people who have argued that Job lived during the time of Jacob, and in fact he was a son-in-law to Jacob. He married his daughter by the name Dinah, something like that, which I found to be interesting. But those are stories he heard from other people and ideas that other people have shared. He himself thinks or thought that Job was a Gentile, and I think even Maimonides kind of mentioned something like that, that it's likely that Job was a Gentile. He was not an Israelite. And that the book of Job was written in a different language, and then it was translated into the Hebrew. So it does add into that mystery of who Job was. Also in this chapter, he talks about Daniel, who wrote the book of Daniel. And he tells us that, of course, he tells us the book of Daniel was not written in Hebrew. It was written in Chaldean, because Daniel was, I think, he either likely was born or he lived much of his life in Babylon. And he also says something very interesting. He says that the book of Daniel was not entirely written by Daniel, that there's some section of it that was written by somebody different. And this same person also wrote some parts of the book of Nehemiah, and he explains why he thinks so. And he also tells us that I think it's during the restoration of the temple or some time after that, there was a lot of conflict between the Sadducees and the Pharisees, which these are our two sects of the Jewish belief. And he tells us that there were, you can call them fakes of the book of Daniel, Ezra, and Esther, written by mostly the Sadducees. They wrote their own versions. There was the version that was accepted by the Pharisees of these three books. But then the Sadducees go ahead and write their own versions with some details changed, not the same as the details in the versions that are written by the Pharisees. And then there was this huge conflict and in the society, and the Pharisees accusing the Sadducees of being behind an evil plan to plant very dangerous ideas in the minds of the people. I found that to be so interesting because I've understood the Bible to have been written in a very peaceful environment, like a very harmonious, very like, of course, this is a divine book. There was no fight. There was nothing. It's just, it's from God. Here's the book. But then when you read Baruch's description and illustration, then you realize, oh, no. This book was a political document. There was a lot of fight over it. People were struggling to have their own ideas included and others removed. And yeah, so yeah. And he also talks about the creation of the synod that decided, of course, which books to have talked about, which included which which decided which books to be included and which one to be excluded. And in fact, throughout looking at the entire explanations he gives, then, as I've said before, this turns out to have been a very political process. The process of putting together the Bible, the Old Testament at least, and it turned out to be a very political process. So that is chapter 10.